I'm just Dean. I'm just a researcher at Charles Darwin University in Australia, also Flinders University in Australia, and with the Centre for Rural Medicine in northern Sweden. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-author here, if I could get the thing to work, Matthew McGrail, who's with Monash University in Australia. The title of our presentation is deliberately provocative, and you can see some alternative titles that we were thinking about. It's not based on the best research either, yet, but what we're trying to do is stimulate some research and to look at what could be done better or differently. I immediately declare a conflict of interest because I do work for rural clinical schools, and I also have a stipendiary appointment with NOSM, so it's in my best interest to say how great they are, and I guess that's typical in our field of research. We're now told that we have enough doctors in rural Australia, but there's still some concern about exactly where they are. So what Matthew and I did is we looked at data from 1986 to 2011 to look at how the distribution of doctors had changed. Why 1986? Well, partly because we had a nice consistent data set starting from then, but partly also because that was before the big modern era of pushing to get rural doctors and rural incentive programs. And why 2011? Well, simply that's because the latest point we had in our data set, although like Canadians, we're waiting for the 2016 census to come out. We divided Australia into 4 geographies: metropolitan, which is the capital cities in each state and territory; major urban, which are regions that have cities of more than 100,000 people or so in them; rural, which are quite accessible places but without those big cities; and remote, which are the best splits. In 1986, metropolitan areas, this graph, 1986 metropolitan areas had about twice the number of doctors per 1,000 population than the national average. Urban areas had about 1.5 times, rural areas had just below the national average, and remote areas did a little bit worse than that. Fast forward to 2011, metropolitan areas had twice the national average, urban areas had about 1.5 times the national average, rural areas had just below the national average, and remote areas did a little worse than that. In other words, at least on this measure, nothing much had changed. It's interesting to note at the end here you can see a large increase in the number of doctors nationally between 2006 and 2011, but it all happened in the metropolitan here and the urban here. This map, I don't know how clearly you can make it out, but it's got red bits where there was a decrease in the GP to population ratio, and blue bits where there was an increase. White areas, there's a few of them, stayed about the same. We could go into each region and try and figure out what happened, but the overall picture is a patchy improvement at best, and probably a worsening distribution for large chunks of rural and remote Australia. Why do we blame medical schools? Well, we don't, actually. But we did the exercise of thinking about what rural clinical schools could be doing to contributing to this apparent lack of improvement. The simple explanation could be that we just haven't been around long enough. I don't think that's true, and if it is true, then it probably presents some problems of its own. I wanted to start by going back to 1986. There were rural doctors. Lots of them, proportionally about as many as there are now. But who were they? And how did they get where they were? Was it all just accident and coincidence? We come forward to 2011 or 2016, we think we know how to get doctors to rural areas, but we haven't actually improved the situation very much. So what could be happening is that our new rural doctors are simply replacing the markets who would have been there anyway, rather than adding to those markets. So either those people who would have been rural doctors anyway are now going through our programs, or more likely our graduates are crowding out people who would have otherwise gone there. This could be because we've convinced doctors that don't do our programs that they don't belong in rural areas. This risk of specialisation has been talked about a bit before, I know, but it does need some more research, I think. One of the critical implications of this is probably later in doctors' careers. So back in 1986, you had a rather large group of relatively older doctors going rural towards the end of their careers, and I think that that group is disappearing, and it could be for this reason. One of the big ones is that we've simply misunderstood the statistics that we base our programs upon. If you get doctors who come from rural backgrounds, who grew up in rural areas, they are more likely to go rural, right? We all know that. Independently to that, if you train doctors or give them rural exposure during training, they're more likely to go rural. These are independent pathways, rural background and rural training. If you add rural training to rural background, you lift that probability a little bit, but not hugely. However, more and more what we're doing is trying to get our rural schools to recruit rural background students. This is the low-hanging fruit that we're talking about in this presentation. From a rural clinical school point of view, this is great because it looks like you don't need to understand this diagram either. It looks like you get lots of people to go rural. But from a system perspective, it's madness. So if you had a rural school of 100 rural background students, you'll get 65 of them to go rural, but 60 of them would have gone rural anyway, so you're adding 5. If you have 100 urban background students, you'll get 20 of them to go rural, but only 5 of them would have gone rural if they hadn't gone to your school, so you're adding 15 to the rural pool. What other problems might we have? One, I think, is our own success. Our success has, in many cases, seen rural clinical schools become more and more urbanised. When we started, I think a lot of the programs started in very small rural communities. Paul's not here, but in South Australia, for example, essentially this kicked off in a town of fewer than 1,000 people, quite an isolated town. However, as we got better at what we were doing, governments and education providers and accreditation boards wanted to replicate that success and wanted to regulate it and make a formula out of it. And this just required more and more facilities that the smaller communities really couldn't deal with. So the demands for the environment for rural training now are such that many rural areas can't engage in that process. We have a very real flow on, is Lucy here? I don't have my glasses on. We have a very real problem with this particular part of the process in South Australia, where we have great rural-oriented rural undergraduate training, but no real link to postgraduate training. So we're letting people slip through the gaps. And the data actually tell us that it's postgraduate training that usually makes the difference. And I know we write lots of papers celebrating how great we are at this, but it's just obvious. People take a job where they're offered the job, and they'll get offered a job during postgraduate. It's very hard to change this because one of the things we think we need to train rural doctors is doctors. If your town does not have doctors who are capable of being preceptors or supervisors or clinical educators, then you don't get students. You don't get students, you don't get people graduate who want to come and work in your town. We've found in the statistics that about 3/4 of graduates will go and practice exactly where they trained, or exactly where they grew up, not nearby. So what you end up is a rich club, which I've already explained, is of larger towns generally, who have this whole system working in their favour, and a poor club of more rural places that miss out altogether. And it seems to me that it's these places that we should be training doctors for. Despite what it sounds like, I'm not blaming rural clinical schools. That's Matthew who's doing that, not me. But what we're trying to do is to dig into some of the aspects that we could look at perhaps improving our performance or preparing ourselves for the next generation of what we could be doing. I just wanted to summarise why I think there could be problems with rural clinical schools, and it's these 5 things here. So rural education may have crowded out the previous markets of rural doctors. We need to investigate that more. Rural education or rural specialisation may prevent particularly older doctors from going rural, and we're seeing an increasing generation imbalance. We have the wrong students in our rural programs if we really want to have a system impact. That's quite challenging, and we need to think about that. Our success may have created structures that mean that we can't do what we do in rural communities anymore. And finally, rural doctors go to very specific locations, and we seem to be reducing the pool of those locations rather than increasing them, particularly in postgrad I'm referring to. So what can we do about it? I don't know. I'm really a problems person. I'm not a solutions person. But we were required to put in some potential solutions. Here's just a couple. I think that rural schools could rethink what they're doing and maybe set up two parallel tasks. One is to get rural kids, or rural students, into programs elsewhere that will help them. Will not only broaden their experience, but it adds to the pool. And then the second is to focus on recruiting urban background students, trying to convert some of these, particularly at the postgrad level. Rural schools should invest more heavily in towns that don't have doctors, because that's where the need is. Sounds simple. I don't exactly know how to do it. You'll have to talk to Heidi about that, who's here. But maybe you could do that through non-clinical placements, research placements, service learning. Maybe there's other sorts of things that you could do. And thirdly, rural schools should be let off the hook a little bit. This is a tough job that we're trying to do. So we should be let off the hook so that we're not measured just on how many of our graduates go rural, but on how much of an impact we have on the overall system. And those people who are evaluating us should wait another 25 years before they tell us whether we're good or bad. Not really. The closing message is that rural schools are not an end in themselves. They're part of a system, a workforce system. That system continues to be inefficient for many rural areas. We have a responsibility to consider whether our role is addressing those inefficiencies or in fact creating greater inefficiencies. And I would like to see more research attention focused on the second part of that equation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on, we have abstract number 1.